So the next stage in our project is to start writing some user stories, which we can use to track the tasks and how we're doing with those tasks throughout our project's completion. So if you're not sure what a user story is, it's simply a detailed description of a particular task that needs to be done in the project, but it's done from the user's perspective, and it's usually based on the use cases that we've got. So for example, things like clicking a button and the actions that that produces, or for example, what happens when the user fills in a form incorrectly or successfully, and some detailed descriptions about how to actually test that, and so that we know when the story is actually done. So if we take a look at the Atlassian website, for example, they've got a bit of a breakdown of what a user story is, and it takes this kind of form of a statement in this format here, where we say, as a certain person, I want to be able to do something so that some end result. So it might be something like, as a user of a particular application, I want to be able to fill out the login form so that I can access the app. And there's some more detailed descriptions about how you would go about doing that, but we're going to write some user stories now, so hopefully this will give you an idea of how you go about doing it. So first of all, if we just go back to our diagram that we created in our first tutorial very quickly, the first use case that we've got is this user over here who wants to go and actually create one of these short URLs to create a redirect URL to then pass on to the user. So let's take that as an example and just take that process of someone creating this short URL and how they might go about doing that. So let's go into our project board that we've got created, and let's add a new task. And I'm going to write the user story statement just directly as the task name. So we might say something like, as a user who wants to rickroll their friends, or say rickroll my friends, or less friends singular, I want to create a short URL so that I can send it to my colleagues or friends. So we've just opened that up in the sidebar here. So that's the basic premise of our user story. So this particular task is all focused on the user, obviously, and we're saying that user that we saw in the diagram, they want to create a rickroll for their friend, and basically they want a short URL to do that. So I want to create a short URL so that I can send it across to my colleagues or friends. So notice we're not really saying anything about how we do that. We're not saying that we want to create a button on the page or we want to have a web page in general. This story is very high level, and it's just talking about the actions that the user would take, and now it's up to the kind of meat of the user story to actually describe how we know when we've achieved this particular task. So how do we know when we've actually achieved this task? We're going to want to move it to in progress and into done and completed once we've done some work on it. And the way we know that this task is done is by adding something called acceptance criteria to the actual story to fill it out a bit and to give it a bit more substance. And we're going to be doing all of this work ourselves, so we'll use this acceptance criteria ourselves to let us know that we've actually completed the task. But if you're working in a larger organization working with quality assurance staff or testing staff, then obviously they would use that acceptance criteria to see that if you as the developer have actually fulfilled the story. So there's another site that I found here which gives you a little bit of an idea of the actual acceptance criteria and how it should look. So here they've got an example user story saying, as a writer, I want to receive notifications when others add comments so that I'm up to date. So presumably some app on a phone or a web device, for example. And here is the acceptance criteria for that user story. So we start with this approach. In fact, I don't know if it shows you here. So we use this given, when, then format, and this is fairly standard to Agile practices as well. So we might end up with something like this saying, given I don't have an app open, when my phone is unlocked, then I should receive a banner notification. So this user story is all about notifications. So they're saying that when the user of the actual app doesn't have it open and their phone is locked, then they should obviously see some kind of notification on their phone to let them know that this writer has added a comment. So that's the format that we're going to use for our acceptance criteria as well. So if we go back to our story that we created here, and I'm just going to add it down here as a comment. Let's actually add it in the detail here in Asana. So we'll say something like this for our first user story that we've created, saying, given that I am on the app's web interface, because don't forget that's all we've really described in the diagram that we created yesterday so far. When I click a button on the page, Then I will be presented with a short URL. So here we're just describing the process of when the user's actually on the web interface, there'll be some kind of button, and we're dictating that by the acceptance criteria. So we're adding a bit more detail to this story. So there'll be some kind of button, and when you click it, then there should pop up a short URL, which is obviously generated by the backend, but we haven't got to that part as of yet. So we can have multiple acceptance criteria as well. So I'm going to add another one to this as well. So what we're going to say here is, given that I have created a short URL, and notice how all of this is from the perspective of the user, not of the developer. Given that I've created a short URL, when I click the relevant button, then the URL should be copied to my clipboard. So here we're adding some further details, saying that first of all there should be another button that appears on the page once the short URL has been generated, and also when you click that you will have the URL copied to your clipboard. So you can go really granular with these acceptance criteria, but because we're creating the project we're going to keep it reasonably simple. I just want to give you an overview of what an Agile user story is and also how you create the acceptance criteria, but we will be referring back to these as we go through our project. So that's pretty much that user story completed. I'm just going to quickly create one more just to give you another example, and then I'll create the rest of the user stories offline, just so you're not sitting here while I create all of the user stories for our project. So let's create another one here. So as a user whom has received a short URL, so this is from the perspective of the consuming user, the user that's received one of the rickroll shortened URLs. I want to be able to open the short URL so that I can view the redirected content, which we know what that's going to be. So let's go and add some acceptance criteria for this as well. So let's just go down here into the description, and just very briefly we'll say, given that I have received a short URL, when I open the URL in my browser, then I should be redirected to the selected content. So just a brief one here, just describing this second action that we created on the diagram the other day. So this is the consuming user that will receive one of these redirected URLs, and obviously when they open that in their browser, we want to go to the API service, which will obviously redirect them to somewhere else. So that user story with that acceptance criteria will just help us keep track of that particular action within the project. So there you go, there's some user stories to get us started for our project. As I say, I'll go away and create the rest of them, and we'll refer back to these as we go through our project. But hopefully that's given you a bit of an understanding of what an Agile user story is, how you would write one, and also how you add acceptance criteria to fill out the detail of the particular task. So that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.